And now, it's time for TJwow.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I am so excited to be with you on the TJwow today. It's a little bit of a different one today. We've got a slightly updated format because we are working with Imparter, and I will introduce you to Richard in just a moment. Now, you know with Training Journal how these things work. This is me. I'm here every month on this webinar. I'm sorry if you're sick of me, but you have to put up with me. I'm the Deputy Editor of TJ. I am your host today. And you know that our conversations here are how we want things to work. The late, great Jay Cross said that conversation was the most powerful learning technology ever invented. And that's why we've got that massive chat window for you to go and use. So please go and share all sorts of links and ideas and thoughts and kind of get chatting with each other. It's there for you to use. Also there for you is at the very bottom of the screen is your Q&A pod. So if you've got a burning question for Richard about any of the topics that we're talking about today, please pop it in there. I promise I will see that question. If it's in the chat window, I usually see it, but sometimes I miss it when it gets a bit busy. So I promise I'll see it on the Q&A. You can go and join us on Twitter, #TJwow, and it would be great for you to go and share a couple of thoughts about what's going on and some of your learning nuggets as well. So you know everything is recorded. It's all available publicly on the Training Journal website. And let's go and see who it is that we are speaking with today from Imparter. We're really lucky today to have Richard with us, and our topic is mainly about kind of sales skills. And I think it's kind of an interesting one about, well, how can that help us in L&D to actually succeed? So this is a little bit different today because normally we have 3 speakers. Today we're just having a really in-depth discussion with Richard. So Richard, let's get you on webcam. Here we go. And we had a last minute bit of hassle where it suddenly didn't work 1 minute before we started, but we got it working again. Oh gosh, you test these things and it doesn't matter. Okay, so Richard, tell us a little bit about who you are.
Certainly. Good morning, Joe. Morning, everybody. My name is Richard Barkey. I'm the founder and CEO of Imparter. We're a global sales and service training company. And I guess kind of 21 years ago now, I was at McKinsey and really interested in learning and worked with Neil Rackham in the sales arena while I was at McKinsey and started Imparter with what was then really, I think, the first learning simulation using computer game technology to help people learn skills. And here we are 21 years later, and I've spent a long time thinking about selling and thinking about L&D, and putting the two together is something that's a real interest for me and us and for TJ right now. So I'm very, very happy to be here and to be on the TJ editorial panel as well.
Well, we're super pleased. Thank you very much, because sales is one of these really strange areas where, we talked about this before, that it can have a bit of an icky reputation, but actually when you look at it, all of the skills are so important. Tell us a little bit about
I think
that.
Sales, especially in this country compared to, say, the US, has a bit of a bad reputation still, and it's seen as slightly snake oily and kind of pushing things onto people when they don't necessarily need them. But a lot of that is because in the way we've taught sales in the past, it's been a very seller-centric approach. So you have a prospect and you have to move them through. These days, one tends to think more about the buyer, and it's actually a very ethical process. It's about uncovering needs, finding the best insights to help them figure out how to meet those needs and so on. And I guess for L&D, it's an area where we can have huge impact, because if you can move the dial on price by 1%, that often increases profits by 10%. If you can improve your win rate from 25% to 50%, that has a big impact as well. So it's a really nice area for L&D to have an impact, but also it's an area where you can measure that impact really, really effectively. And that is always a good thing, as we know.
It's a really big thing in L&D to try and prove our worth almost. There's a conversation around that. So when we get past that kind of negative ickiness of what sales used to be as a reputation, and actually look beneath that, there are a number of...
Yeah. So I guess the basic premise for today's webinar was kind of saying, right, how can we learn and, well, not learn because a lot of people here are very experienced already, but how can we leverage the skills that salespeople use in uncovering needs at an external customer and building momentum behind an opportunity and so on, and apply those to an internal customer. So as L&D, working with the head of sales or head of sales enablement or whoever it might be, how can we leverage the same skills that we're going to teach them to kind of get initiatives moving? So the poll that I can see has gone up there was kind of just initially asking people to give a sense of where your strengths are as a group, the people on this call, because we'll use this to kind of fine-tune the time allocation between different topics today. So if I could ask everybody just to pick 3 of the abilities in that list. So uncovering needs that L&D can meet, building momentum behind an initiative, quantifying the value that we can add, pitching to the stakeholders, managing those stakeholders and their decision process, alleviating risk, and measuring and achieving results. And then we can see a pattern emerging there about where people's relative strengths and weaknesses are.
Yeah, getting a lot of clicking in here, and then we can see the results. We can see the bars jumping up and down as you're all making your selections. So let me share these results out and see what we're all thinking now. There's more than 20 of you on the session today, so let's make sure we get lots of clicks in here. Richard, what is it that you're seeing here, and are you surprised or not by these results?
It is an interesting pattern, actually. So obviously here we're seeing the biggest strength is in pitching a solution to stakeholders, and also in kind of managing and influencing those stakeholders towards a desired outcome. And actually, if you did the same poll for a group of level salespeople, you'd probably see a similar perception, because people like the chase, they like the pitch, the kind of, the excitement of getting in front of stakeholders, and generally are very persuasive. I think the bit that's harder for salespeople to do really well, and interesting that seems to be the same for the group here, is kind of uncovering needs in the first place. So it's easier if a stakeholder comes to you and says, I want this kind of initiative, but to get in there and identify opportunities where L&D can add value and then build momentum behind that within the organization is actually a bit harder. It's a trickier skill. So I'm not surprised to see that, but it's good that people feel confident in pitching. That's fantastic. The other thing I would point out here is identifying and alleviating risk is something that not many people in the sales force do either, or think they're good at. And that moment after you've made a presentation, and there are typically 2 presentations that happen in a big journey like this. One is about, do we need to do something? And the second one is, should we do it internally, or is this solution the right solution? But once you've done either of those, there's often a kind of a pause where stakeholders don't come back to you for a little while. And that's often a point where salespeople and L&D people step back and go, well, I'll just wait for them to finish their deliberations within the committee. But actually what is often going on there is this issue around risk, and people are worrying about what might go wrong at different levels, and engaging more actively at that stage can have a big impact on the outcome. So I think that's a really cool set of responses there. Thank you, everybody. What I point out is that those questions, the kind of abilities I've listed there, actually sit around something that we call the buying cycle, the buying journey, if you like. And again, this is very much focused on being customer-centric rather than about the sales process. And Hannah, I've just seen your comment there that wasn't your strength, it's what you want to learn. So, okay, that may be, we weren't clear enough about that, but I'll bear that in mind, Hannah, thank you. So the slide that's coming up in a second is just going to show what that buying cycle looks like. And this is something I worked on 20 years ago with Neil Rackham, actually, based on his early behavioral research. And it typically begins at the top there, where we talk about the awareness of needs. And that's where a client, be it internal or external, moves from being happy with the status quo, so that there's no need to change, through a process of discovery, or potentially somebody like an internal stakeholder or L&D or an external person gets them to think about things in a different way. They realize that things could change. And the key skill for us in that stage is identifying the opportunities in the first place, but also finding the stakeholders who really care about those opportunities and building momentum behind that within the organization. And then finally about proving value to the stakeholders. So the question that Joe was asking there is how we can use this in L&D. And yes, so this is basically about thinking about the decision process that, let's say, your internal head of sales, or indeed, the CEO, if you're looking at management training, is going through when you're approaching them with an idea. And Hannah, yes, we do sales and service training around the world. That's right. So the first stage is the awareness of needs. And when you get to that end of the awareness of needs phase, you have hopefully a bunch of stakeholders who recognize that there is something that could be done better. And then we move into the assessment of alternatives phase, where they're looking at alternative solutions and different ways that they could meet that need. So the key skill in that stage is figuring out what their decision criteria will be, creating not just a pitch, a presentation to those internal stakeholders, but a pitch strategy. So how can you win that deal, or get them to agree to allocate resources internally? And finally, how do you manage stakeholders in that process to align all of the stakeholders? Then we go to alleviation of risk, and I'll stop talking in a second, but I just wanted to kind of set this framework out. So then we get to alleviation of risk, and the key things here are basically just identifying and being aware that risks might be there at a strategic level, tactical, even political and personal. Then there's a decision where we might need to unblock a decision process. And finally, we're out there kind of achieving results and trying to establish and reestablish that trusted advisor status. So lots and lots of decisions go through this kind of a process. And one of the key insights for salespeople when they're dealing with clients is if you know where the client is or the customer is in their decision journey, it's much easier for you to guide them and to influence and to bring insight to their thinking. And exactly the same thing applies within L&D, approaching a stakeholder within your own organization.
Thank you for that, Richard. I am still here, I promise. My webcam has decided to have a little off moment. So I'm going to switch that off for now and come back to it. But I promise you I'm still here. Now, this makes a lot of sense to me as you talk through the process that people in the business are thinking. And I think this is useful for us in terms of understanding actually how we need to do things in business within L&D, but also how we need to deal with our clients, either external clients or our internal clients. And in the chat window, Ava says she wished she understood this years ago. Now, Piers makes a really good point that he finds a difference between what people want and what they need. So, Richard, what part of the buying cycle is that at? And also kind of what skills are we focusing on there?
Yeah. So want versus need, Piers, is a really interesting point. I guess in that awareness of needs phase, if I can put it this way, a need versus a want. A want is an explicit need. It's something that people either don't need but think they do, or they do and they know that they do, if I can put it that way. Whereas a need can be a latent need, and part of what we're doing in that early phase is not just leaving it to the stakeholder to figure out what it is that we could help them with, but being proactive and actually going, I'm going to help you to uncover and be aware of things that maybe you weren't aware of before. In the sales world, the big buzzword over the last few years has been insight. And, everybody is talking about how you bring insight to your stakeholders as a way of partly disrupting their thinking and getting them to realize that there are things they could be doing differently. And the way we think about that is there are three things that you can bring insight to help make a need become a want, if you like. The first is helping them to understand their objectives and the ones that they're not achieving sufficiently. The second is uncovering the barriers to achieving those objectives and the causes of those barriers. And then finally, it's about kind of bringing in your capabilities, internal or combined with external, to show them solutions that they weren't aware of. And Hannah, yes, we have done a lot of work with O2, that's right. So I'm just having a look at the chat window. So Neha, yes, I think for awareness needs, basically it is a consulting activity. That's exactly right. It's kind of getting intimate with the business issues and trying to figure out how we can support the business in achieving their objectives. That's right.
Thank you for that. And I'm back now, which is brilliant. And
let's have
a little bit look more at the chat window. And sort of around performance consulting, awareness of needs. So this is all about identifying those opportunities that are available to you, aren't they? And once we've gone through that phase, once we've used performance consulting or action mapping or some other buying and sales kind of process, and we've gone from need and want and identified those opportunities, what's that next stage that we need to start looking at and the skills that we need in L&D?
Well, I think, if you don't mind, because that was an area that was relatively low on the kind of confidence level in that first poll, I might just drill into that awareness of needs bit a little bit first. Is that okay? Because what happens next is the kind of the selection of the best option. But I think that building momentum around an opportunity is kind of is actually pretty important. So we have a couple of polls, everybody, that I wanted to just use as a way of getting us all thinking, because rather than just me talking, I'm a big believer in learning by doing and experiential learning. We can't do a full simulation here on the webinar, but I did want to ask you, if let's imagine a little scenario here where you've got a meeting with your chief sales officer, CSO, or head of sales, or whatever the right term is in your organization. And you are going to talk to them about a new sales skill initiative. And there are kind of three options here about ways you could approach that meeting. So you could explain the features, advantages, and benefits of your proposal. You could identify barriers to achieving their objectives across the business, or you could do a TNA across the target population and use that to figure out what their needs might be. So if I could ask you all just to kind of pick one of these options and vote away, and then we will see where we come up as a group.
Yeah, it's a bit of an interesting one here, really, is because L&D, as a complete stereotype, are often being told you don't have the skills to get to the top table, you don't influence the C-suite, you're not business oriented enough. Now, that's certainly not the case for all people in all skills and all teams. And I think sometimes we can be hard on ourselves. Sometimes the narrative isn't the same as what's being achieved. But it's, and also, I mean, Hannah makes a really great point. We shouldn't have to get to the top table. It's not about that. What's your reaction and thought to that, Richard?
Yeah, I think, well, two things. First of all, going to the top table to begin with, rarely a good idea. You need to kind of build a case and build some support before you go there, unless you're the HR director, in which case you're already there. But the second thing I would say is that the skills that get you to engage with the C-suite, and we actually do quite a lot of training around reaching the C-suite and that kind of thing, they tend to be a bit like good dinner party conversation skills. It's always about asking good questions as well as telling stories. And really, you don't, I can go into an organization that I don't know, and within an hour I can understand enough to sound reasonably competent, but it's just because I've been doing it for a long time. And it's a skill that can be learned, right? If you understand the issues in an organization, the key is not to try and sound smart. The key is to ask smart questions and then add insight where you can. So I think L&D absolutely can have a seat at the top table, especially around specific issues, but uncovering needs is the right way to get there, and asking good questions is easier than going in with a strong agenda sometimes. So looking at the results of this poll, I think I might have given the answer away a little bit by talking about barriers to objectives earlier, but I think that's right. I mean, the first one, the kind of features, advantages and benefits of a proposal, or FAB as it used to be called, is not wrong. It's a little old school, perhaps, that approach of features. I mean, the whole principle of old sales training is that you don't just talk about features, you've got to talk about benefits. The issue is that if you talk about benefits, you can't really explain them out of the context of what's being sold. So I would actually say that FAB is something that can be useful later on in a discussion, once you know the objectives you're helping with, because then when you talk about benefits, you can use the language of the client, the internal customer, rather than your own assessment. Now, if you're in the organization, you may know that already, but that's a later stage thing. TNA can work very well, but it tends to test at its basic level. A TNA tests whether skills are needed rather than what the value of building those skills will be. So yes, my preference would be that kind of middle answer, the identifying barriers to achieving objectives across the business. And if we could go to the slide deck, Joe, very quickly. Right. So there's a tool that we use here that I'd commend to you as a way of thinking about this. And it's just a way of kind of structuring your thinking as you go into a meeting with a senior stakeholder. It's called the value chain, and it's adapted from strategy world, actually. But on the left-hand side, you can see we have KPIs, so key performance indicators, the things that stakeholder is measured on a month-to-month basis, their current challenges and their wider goals. And we found that asking about those three levels of objective is quite powerful. And then, you can look at different parts of the C-suite, but sales is what we're talking about today. And then as you uncover those objectives, you can sort of fill this in. So sales, this is very simplistic, but sales will often have revenue and margin targets they need to hit. They might want to establish a coaching culture, and their wider goal might be to empower the partner network to drive revenue, for example. And you can build up this kind of value chain as you go through the rest of the organization. What that gives you is an ability to then kind of map your internal capabilities onto those objectives, and also to prioritize. So to have a conversation with the stakeholder seniorly, the senior stakeholder, to test your understanding of these objectives, and then have that conversation about how you might be able to support them in overcoming the barriers. So this is a tool that we often use in that first engagement with a senior stakeholder.
I really like this because one of the things it does, which again L&D often need to concentrate on, is it really focuses on the business needs. We're having a conversation in the chat window about kind of training needs analysis, and the idea that actually signifies it's a training need. And our peers agreed with that, and I said, well, how do you focus on the wider business issues? What do you do? And he said, ask daft questions. But they aren't daft, are they, Richard? Because we're uncovering the needs that we have in the business. And I was just sharing in the chat window that actually different departments within an organisation can feel like a different business or client to me anyway. And Hannah's saying it's an excellent model. It's really focusing on the different areas and the different goals they have. So tell us a little bit more, Richard.
just coming back to the point about daft questions, I mean, a lot of time is spent learning, often talking about kind of open questions versus closed questions. And I think when you're going into a senior stakeholder, whether it's sales or anywhere else, as the CEO of a company, if somebody comes to me and starts asking open questions right at the beginning, I often feel that they haven't really earned the right to do that, and it's kind of a waste of my time. And a lot of sales methodologies teach that, but it's good but used in the right place. And sometimes it's valuable to come in with a hypothesis, to recognize it's a hypothesis and say, I'd like to test my understanding, but it's much more useful to me as a stakeholder if somebody comes to me with something like this and uses it to either ask hypothesis-based questions or to just literally put it in front of me and go, does this look about right? And it's a framework for me then to add to and change rather than starting from scratch. So having a little bit of preparation and asking smart questions, I think is the right way to use questions rather than kind of totally blank questions that are content free. Daft questions are fine. If you're kind of like, what if this? Asking a question that's going to stimulate thought is cool. So from here, Joe, sorry, carry on.
Those daft questions can be really good too. Oh, sorry, we had a little bit of lag there. Those daft questions, as Piers puts it, can really make us think about things. I know when I've been asked those things in the past and somebody goes, it's probably too simple, it's too basic, it's silly to ask. But sometimes those are the ones that make me think the most. So
no, that's cool. And again, as a senior stakeholder myself, if somebody comes to me and asks a thought-provoking question that makes me think about a situation in a different way, that's hugely valuable. So I guess if we follow through this kind of process, imagine you've had that first interaction with the senior stakeholder, and you've kind of got to the point where you've identified a need, but to the point earlier, it's not a want yet. The next step in this is kind of to build momentum within that initial awareness of needs phase. So we had another little poll kind of just following the story on. So imagine now that you've kind of had that first meeting, and yes, there's a need, but not yet an explicit want. How would you approach that? How would you try and build some momentum behind this idea of doing some sales training within the sales team? So firstly, quantify the consequences if action is not taken. Second, quantify the gain or ROI if action is taken. Or thirdly, find stakeholders who really care about this issue. So let's see how people come out on this one.
Yeah, and I imagine actually a lot of people, like on the last poll, will say, well, all of those and more. Here are some different things. And
so,
all of those answers are
well, I won't comment on that just yet. I'll let people finish this first.
That's fair enough. And I think there's a lot of people have read various articles, maybe from TJ, maybe elsewhere, maybe blog posts, about all of these having a benefit. But I'm sure what we're going to discuss through is, well, which thing should we do at which time to build that momentum rather than try and deal with objections and stuff like that. I think knowing when to do these different things is important. So again, let me just share those results. Again, they're changing as people think and make up their mind. So how do you build momentum behind this? What are you seeing here, Richard?
There is kind of, there's a wrong answer, but it's about timing, as you say, you're spot on. So A and C are both correct. So quantifying the action, the consequences if you don't do some training is a really good way to build momentum. Also, bringing other stakeholders into the discussion who care about that issue already is also a very good way to build momentum. The middle one is interesting. So quantifying the gain is very important, but it's about when you do it. And if you think back to behavioral economics, there's and psychology, there's a thing called loss aversion, or loss aversion bias, as it's called in the terminology. And what that means is people will often take more direct action to avoid a loss than they will to achieve a gain. what that means when you're dealing with a senior stakeholder, trying to get them to kind of recognize the value of what you're suggesting, is choosing the first one and being clear about what happens if you don't fix this. So we might lose market share, you might not hit your targets this year. Although it's intuitively a more difficult conversation to have, it's actually more powerful as a way of achieving change than going straight to gain. So to put it very simply, you've got to uncover pain before you demonstrate gain. So it's about kind of getting it right, essentially, between the balance between those two things. And that's something that a lot of salespeople don't do very well either.
Now that's really interesting. So why is it that we don't do that well? Is it because it naturally doesn't feel right?
I think, well, there's two things. One is people who are successful tend to kind of get satisfaction. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy, their self-actualization often comes from being experts and understanding things and sounding like they know what they're talking about. And the second is people like to be comfortable. So when you're talking about the benefits of something, you're in your comfort zone and you're sounding smart. To start asking questions about what might go wrong if we don't do this, is, it's a negative thing. It's a bit less comfy to do. And it doesn't allow you to demonstrate your knowledge necessarily. So it's the more powerful strategy, but it's a much harder one to get yourself to do in the moment.
Absolutely. I think you make some really great points there. And Adele has said some really good points through this poll as a little food for thought. So thank you there from Adele. And she says,
Adele, the truth is, I probably
always
will
go
tend
for
to
the
as well.
positives naturally. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about. Yeah, it's a natural thing to do, and also I think then asking those questions about how will this impact sales or market share or customers or whatever those things are in your area can actually be maybe feel invasive or challenging, and perhaps sometimes people want that kind of thing too. And Hannah says she likes it too, and she says, I like the sound of my own voice sounding knowledgeable. Yes. Me too. I like that. I think that's why I like doing the podcasts and webinars. It's all about that. Now, one of the things that we've got here in the poll on screen is, as we've talked about, kind of to quantify those consequences if they haven't been taken. But also there's that gain and ROI. Now, ROI, we're being told, Richard, is actually a little bit difficult for a training department to say, here is the return on investment, because people are saying, well, actually, we're a cost centre and we're not a sales area. We shouldn't be making money.
Indeed.
Otherwise, everyone would be training.
When I talk about ROI in that sense, what I mean is the return on investment for the company. So it's the benefit, which might, as Hannah says, it could be non-financial, or strategy. But it's about the benefit of what we're doing in L&D for the organisation as a whole. So if we invest 100,000 in training, however many people in a sales methodology or in sales skills, what impact will that have on the business? And will the business net do better because of that than they would have done before? So it's about the business impact. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, exactly what Dale has just said there. Thank you, Dale. And I shared, I can't remember who said it to me, so apologies, I'm not telling you who it was, but somebody said recently about return on intent. So it's that idea of what does the business benefit from this rather than we've made X amount of money. Okay. So welcome, Gail. We're talking about the skills we need from sales or to work with sales within L&D. A really good conversation so far. So, Richard, we're talking about how we build momentum. Is this as far as we go? Do we need to kind of have a look at, once we've built some momentum, once we've done these things?
I think, there's a lot more that one could say about that. So fundamentally, it's about, if you just build pain, you've created dissatisfaction that people can't do anything about. If you just build gain, you have something that's nice to have. So you've got to build pain and gain, or uncover pain and gain, in order to drive a good outcome for you. So that's kind of where, now obviously there's a huge amount of other stuff that goes on in that phase, but once you've got momentum built and you've started to understand the different positions of different stakeholders, and you can manage and influence those stakeholders, that's the next step. But then I think it's probably worth moving on to talk about the kind of pitching and assessment of alternatives phase. And yes, is that Gail? I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but yes, it is about the consequences of not doing something, of not acting. And the idea is that if you can help stakeholders to understand that, then they will be more likely to take action. So I wanted just the next little section just to talk about kind of how you present an option. So let's imagine that we have uncovered needs, and just this is showing the pain and gain and the kind of minor needs to urgent needs spectrum. About presenting options in this assessment of alternatives phase. And we have another poll here, Joe, which I'm bring up. Fantastic. So here's a question for you. I'd like you to think about what percentage of African nations are members of the UN. And if I could ask you not to Google this, just to kind of have a think about what you think the answer might be. And I'd like you to consider whether that number, the percentage of African nations, is greater or lesser than 10%. Okay? So just fill out the poll. I'm going to jump off camera for 1 second. I'll be right back, Joe.
So let's just pause Richard there. So we've been having a great conversation so far around the skills that we need to be looking at the problems that people are having and the opportunities that we have to solve those, whether that's selling something in the traditional sense, or in our sense in L&D, selling our intervention or our support. We just talked through the building momentum phase and how to make sure that we're focusing on the negative impact as opposed to necessarily going for that gain, and making sure that we understand the loss first of all. And now this presenting options part, and there's a really interesting question, and in preparing this ahead of time, I didn't know the answer to this at all. I got this completely wrong. So it's really interesting to see what it is that you guys are coming up with on this answer. So make sure in the chat window you make some comments and thoughts and share some ideas about what it is that you are doing and you are thinking around this. And also remember, we have that question pod at the bottom. And not many of you have answered this. We've got nearly 20 of you here, and we've got 2, 4, 6, maybe 10 of you have answered. So let's get a couple more answers in there, and then we will share the results. So I think this is an interesting question, Richard, and I was just saying, I had no idea about this when you prepped it, and a bit of why on earth is this question in here? So let me share results.
So we've got a bunch of people saying kind of 10, 15, 20%, a few people saying 80%. And there is a point behind this, which I'll explain in a second. So the correct answer to what percentage of African nations are members of the UN is actually 100%. And what you're seeing here is an example of what's called anchoring in the behavioral economics field. So because the questions here were biased towards the low end, and because I asked you to consider whether the percentage was greater or lesser than 10%, I in effect anchored you at a very low number. If I'd run this experiment differently and asked you to consider whether or not that number was greater or lesser than 80%, we would have had a much higher set of scores in that box, which is a really fascinating result. I mean, our brains are so manipulable, really. Right, yes, I'm not suggesting we should do this, but in a negotiation, for example, about budget, quite often, if you anchor too low and you start talking about a budget for an internal initiative at too low a level, it can make it very difficult to kind of achieve what you want. Equally, if you anchor too high, there's something called the chilling effect, where people will actually go, well, that's just stupid. But the trick is when you present a proposal for some kind of internal initiative to anchor at a sensible point, that means that people are thinking about your ideas in a way that's going to be achievable later on. Now, there's another kind of version of this which I'm going to move on to. So there's a second poll here, if we can. Oh, actually, no, sorry, it's not a poll; it's a slide. If we can show the next slide. Right. So this is a question about Starbucks for everybody. And I won't bother doing a poll on this one, but there are three main sizes at Starbucks. There's tall, there's grande, and venti. Now, when I ask you which of these three you typically go for in a Starbucks shop or a Costa Coffee or whatever, and there's no poll, so maybe you could just put some things in the chat window. Which one would people typically go for? Grande, yeah.
Hannah says it drives her nuts every time she goes in there. So we're going to steer clear of the coffee shop and sizing and naming issue. Otherwise, we'll hijack our last 15 minutes of the session.
There's a lot of grande, right?
Grande,
so
medium grande,
the venti
grande
is 561 milliliters. That is bigger than the average human stomach. So why do you think, I know, exactly, why do you think Starbucks introduced the venti? Give you some thoughts in the chat. To make you fat. I think coffee on its own does that. It might make you bloated.
No idea, is it?
Yes, to make us get the middle on. Thank you, Mike. That's exactly right. It is another version of anchoring, and in this case, it's called framing. And so it's a bit like when an estate agent shows you two rubbish flats and then one good one. It's a way of kind of highlighting the benefits of one option and yes, a little bit manipulative, moving people towards a chosen outcome. So most people would never buy a venti, but the presence of the venti makes it more likely that people will buy the grande. Now, Starbucks being a relatively, well, I won't say anything about Starbucks just in case somebody from Starbucks is on the call. But anyway, they decided that venti was actually was more profitable to sell than grande. So how do you think they achieved more sales of venti? Question. By introducing another one called the Trenta, which is about 50% bigger than the human stomach. And they did that basically so that the massive venti suddenly seems a lot more reasonable. I know, isn't it absolutely ridiculous? Now, I'm not suggesting that you guys should do this when you present things to your sales leaders, but being aware of how options are perceived when you present them is, I think, really important. And the way you frame a decision has a huge impact on the way that decision ultimately goes. So it's just worth being aware of those simple facts. There are other tricks when you're presenting a proposal, and the most important one is to understand how people make a decision like that. And that's often by having a list of decision criteria that they use to evaluate option A, option B, option C. And the more you understand, I won't go into this in detail now, but the more you understand those decision criteria and how you are perceived against them, the more likely you are to be able to have a decent strategy for your presentation and to get agreement to proceed with the initiative that you're proposing.
I love that. That's a really top tip. So I'm going to call that the Starbucks tip from now on. Thank you.
So next thing is, so you've presented your options to the stakeholder group, and we're in that assessment of alternatives phase still. And I think this is an area coming up that people said that they were generally pretty comfortable with, but this is about influencing stakeholders. And by the way, just before we move off this slide, if you go into Starbucks, there is a short cup, which is the one on the left-hand side there, which is a sensible size for a coffee, but you have to ask for it. They don't put it out. So if we go to the next poll, Joe, if we could. And hopefully this format is helpful just to get you guys thinking rather than me kind of talking about this for an hour. So if we imagine that we are trying to, actually, I think this is, it looks like we've moved to the one on risk, actually. Is the previous one, Joe? If not to worry, but.
Oh, okay.
Okay, well, carry on. It's fine, no problem. So, okay, we've jumped across the stakeholder thing to risk. Can I just go back to the slides for 1 second, Joe, just to talk about that briefly? No, it's fine, no problem. So we won't do the poll on this, but
that's probably my fault. Apologies.
So my background originally was at McKinsey, as I said, and at McKinsey they basically remove your brain and replace it with a 2x2 matrix. So a lot of my thinking tends to be in grids like this. But it's useful to think about stakeholders in two ways. One is the level of influence that they have over a decision from low to high. And the second is the amount of alignment they have with the outcome that you're looking for. On the right-hand side is for, and the left-hand side is against. Yeah, we could all do with more grids in our lives. So it's quite useful when you're thinking about a stakeholder group to plot people on a grid like this. And if you have somebody who's high influence and against you, like Amy in this grid, and by the way, the words underneath are the reason why they are in that position. So it's their primary motivator for being where they are. So Amy is what I would call a nemesis. She's a strong opponent because of her cost focus. Bob is a supporter, a strong supporter, a champion, in fact, highly influential and on your side. And Charlie is a weak supporter, so strongly aligned for, but relatively low influence level. And once you understand where people sit on this grid, you can sort of start to build some strategies for how to deal with this. So Amy, you could either reduce her influence, perhaps by bringing somebody else into the discussion, or try and change her point of view and align her more with your desired outcome. And that might be through different influencing skills that I won't go into now, but I'm sure you guys are familiar with them. With somebody like Bob, who is a champion, a strong-ish supporter, the greater you can influence their level of influence, in fact, by giving them help, by providing them with extra information and training, internal coaching, you can lift them up in terms of influence, and the same for Charlie. So the way things stand in this grid at the moment, you probably wouldn't get anything to happen because the biggest opponent is actually the most influential person. But if you can change the dynamic of the group, maybe by introducing another person, a kind of Dawn, to come in and be up in that top right-hand corner. But it's a useful way of thinking about stakeholder groups, this. And often these things do come down to the way people interact and their perceptions as much as it does the facts and figures. So thinking about the soft skills of this around stakeholder alignment is also really useful. And again, these are skills that salespeople use in selling to their clients all the time, and it's the kind of stuff we teach. but it's also helpful for L&D to help you think about how you sell ideas and initiatives to your internal stakeholders.
Yeah, that's all really good stuff about the way I see it. Any sales skill, it's relationship building, storytelling, making sure that people know that you are the expert or the great resource to come to, because that for me is also managing the stakeholders, and doing what you're doing here is actually a little bit about kind of trying to mitigate and alleviate that risk that people are seeing, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm here, Joe. You froze a little bit just then, but I can hear you.
Richard, are you there? Are we having some lag again, maybe?
That's right.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Can I just talk to Hannah briefly? So Hannah's stuck with a proposal, so they're not making a decision because the FD is blocking everything right now. So, this then is not a bad tool perhaps to use. And as with all these things, it's fairly common sense, but it's trying to figure out what the basis of that objection is. Is it because he doesn't want to, or she doesn't want to spend money, or is there something else? So if you can change them, otherwise you might need to bring in other people to the conversation who are able to kind of have that conversation with you in the background or on your side. It's a she. Good. So yes, I think thinking through this strategy, and obviously it would take a longer conversation to really get under the skin of it, but it's a good way of thinking about a situation like that. And we come across this all the time where, there are people that you may not even have known about who are getting in the way of what otherwise would be a good initiative. So let's kind of finish off. I see we've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to leave a little bit of time for any Q&A. So I'm not going to do the poll on risk, Joe. I'm just going to jump to this slide just to talk about risk, if that's all right. So there are 4 levels of value that in sales we tend to talk about. One is strategic value, things like kind of competitive advantage in the marketplace. There's tactical value, which might be improving a process or improving a particular metric, like win rate in competitive deals. There's political value, which is helping somebody to look good and be successful in the organization. And there's individual value, which might be, making my life easier, less stressful, and so on. Now, just as there are 4 levels of value, when we talk about risk, there are 4 levels of risk that map onto those values, because the risk is of value not being delivered, essentially. So what we're trying to do in the alleviation of risk phase is to uncover what risks are being perceived, and then to do 2 or 3 things, actually. The first is where there's a misperception, to correct it. And the second is to try and make it less likely that the risk will materialize, and that's a prevention strategy. So it might be, if we're talking about a training initiative, it might be doing a needs analysis. It might be about teeing things up and doing a proper connect phase with the organization and making sure people are bought in and understand what's going on, rather than diving straight into the training. That's prevention. Reducing the impact is the third strategy, and that's a cure strategy. And that's all about kind of going, right, if something bad does happen, how can we limit the effect it has? It's basically an insurance policy. And that might mean early warning systems. It might, like a level 1 feedback from training to see if there's an issue. It might be having a rapid response, or if you're dealing with an external organization, might be a service level agreement. So this is one area that a lot of people are not that familiar with, but in any decision that you're trying to get made, a senior stakeholder will always be thinking about what could go wrong as we get to the end of that buying cycle. And so if you're ahead of that, if you're anticipating that might happen, it puts you in a really good position to become even more of a trusted advisor to those senior stakeholders and help them to identify and overcome their own risks. So
Absolutely, and I love that point you make about building trust, because that's really our last point today in literally our last
there's a brilliant book
minute.
by a guy called, or several people, David Maister, Charles Green, and a number of other people, called The Trusted Advisor, and it's something I would recommend anybody to read. They boil trust down to an equation that looks like this: credibility plus reliability plus intimacy, all divided by self-orientation. And in 30 seconds or less, the biggest issue here is about self-orientation. So if you imagine these are all scored out of 10, if you were extremely credible, that's 10. You were very reliable, did what you said, that's 20. You were intimate with the business issues, which is what that means, and you were curious about them, that's 30. But if you are focused on your own agenda or your L&D agenda, and you don't come across as being focused on the stakeholders' agenda, you can divide all of that by 10 and you're back down to 3. Whereas if you're not self-oriented, that could be a score of 30. So trust is all about avoiding self-orientation in a macro and a micro sense. So don't have your agenda, and in a meeting, don't talk over people and try and look smart. Hard to do, easy to say. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have an agenda, by the way. It just means you need to suspend it when you're working with senior stakeholders like this.
I really love this point, and it's one that I definitely need
to
focus on myself around this. But I think we could almost do a whole webinar just about that one point that you've got there, Richard. Has been so interesting. I've got so much value from this. Guys, in the chat window, what's some of the value that you've got from today? What are some of the learning nuggets or the
Thanks very much, everybody.
Taking away?
Thank you, Joe.
Richard, we're going to come off webcam now, so let's just wave a goodbye whilst I go into our wrap up. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. So do share a little bit in the chat window about what it is that you are taking away from today, about the discussion and the presentation. Thank you, David, that we're all salespeople and great models. Thank you, Joe. And a huge thank you to Richard and Imparter for this discussion. I've learned so much from it, and I really hope that you have too. And what we've got coming up, well, we always have more webinars available to have a look at. The sessions are all on the Training Journal website. You can continue the conversation on Twitter with #TJwow. And also we've got some webinars coming up in the future as well. And we look forward to seeing you on those too. So if you want to go and find out a little bit more, there's the Imparter website, and you can go and follow them on Twitter too. And the things that you've learned, well, great discussion, great models. Nigel said, uncover the pain before you demonstrate the gain, and loved that. Thank you, Nigel. And Gail said, good session. Sorry to have missed the beginning, and really echoed the risk of doing nothing. What a brilliant experience today. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you on our next webinars. We've got one coming up later this month about customer experience, one about marketing L&D, one about learning.